In its early days, the can was actually too expensive for most people, because each can had to be handmade, and the food had to be cooked for hours on end. At the time, the main market for tinned food was the Army and Navy.
Once upon a time, the tin can was a miracle, something that could store food for months. Now, the tin can's ubiquitous. Worldwide, over 200 billion of them are made every year. And not just your boring cans of tuna or baked beans either. No, pretty much any foodstuff can be wrapped in metal, from oysters to pork legs, from evaporated milk to full-size hamburgers. How can it be that food suddenly stays good when it's put in a can? And who was it who came up with this marvellous idea?
The winner was a Parisian man named Nicolas Francois Appert. After experimenting for 15 years, Appert came up with this idea of bottling. He thought that food would spoil when exposed to air, as wine did. And so he submitted a method of boiling food in wide-mouthed bottles, sealing them with a cork and pitch, making them airtight. In effect, the bottle becomes a small pressure cooker in which the food boils at temperatures higher than 100 degrees. The pressure cooker had actually been invented about 100 years earlier, in the late 17th century, by French physicist and mathematician Denis Papin. He had made a large cast iron vessel with a tightly fitted lid that locked and dubbed it digester. It was able to make the hardest bones of beef itself as soft as cheese. And yet Appert didn't know how or why the food didn't spoil half as fast when bottled. Nor did anyone else, for that matter. It took another 50 years before someone found out why the preservation process worked so well.
But that didn't matter to Napoleon, who quickly provided his soldiers with bottled food. As Napoleon said, "An army marches on its stomach." And the French army did come close to conquering all of Europe. These cans were handmade, making them too expensive for the majority of the public. A good worker could make 4 cans in a day. Nowadays, it's more like 400 cans per minute. That's a whopping 50,000 times faster. A much-needed increase because the demand for tinned food skyrocketed during the large-scale wars in the 19th century, such as the Crimean War, the American Civil War, and the Franco-Prussian War. More armies needed to march on their stomachs or tinned food. The soldiers fighting these wars in America and Europe returned home spreading the word about this miracle can that could preserve food for years on end. That's how the world slowly learned about the can, even though the can still had some rather unappetizing aspects. So why did the seemingly breakthrough invention of the can remain potentially dangerous for so long? Mind you, back in the 1800s, mankind had no knowledge of these pesky little creatures called bacteria. Odd, really, to think we didn't really know. And yet bacteria are just about the most omnipresent creature around. They're everywhere. But someone did discover them. Indeed, we're about to head into a story dealing with life on the smallest scale. In 1859, a Frenchman called Louis Pasteur finds the scientific explanation for the preservation method behind canning. Indeed, 50 years after the invention of bottled and canned foods, we finally found out why it worked. Louis Pasteur found this out by disproving a theory that had held sway for 2 millennia. If the French military was to travel farther and longer on the provisions it carried, then other armies needed to do so as well. The early 1800s was a time when trading and colonizing expeditions led people to travel farther and farther, and a need for preserved food grew. But it would be nice if the food was stored in less fragile containers.